live question and answer session of Doing Ethnography Remotely, hosted by the Center for Global Ethnography at Stanford University. I'm Sylvia Yanagisako, Professor of Anthropology and co-director of the center. My co-hosts for this session are Sharika Thiranagama, also Professor of Anthropology and co-director of the center, and David Stanford, PhD candidate in Modern Thought and Literature and our event organizer. While we are holding this event to discuss the effects of the pandemic on our research, we also want to acknowledge that the pandemic has had a disproportionate effect on Black and minority communities in the United States and elsewhere. We want to thank all of you for joining us in the midst of our collective grief and anger at the continuing violence against Black communities in the United States. We stand in solidarity with all of you who are protesting anti-Blackness and racial injustice. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves so you can see them. And so let us start with Yarimar Bonilla.
Hi, yes, I'm Yarimar Bonilla. I'm a political anthropologist and I teach at Hunter College in the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican and Latino Studies.
Our second panelist is Iris Braverman.
Hi, so I am a professor of law and an adjunct professor of geography at the University at Buffalo, the State University of New York. Welcome.
Next, we have Heather Horst.
Hi, my name is Heather Horst, and I'm an anthropologist by training, but I'm currently the director of the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University in Australia.
And our next panelist is Sarah Pink.
Hi, I'm Sarah Pink. I'm an anthropologist and visual anthropologist by training, and I'm currently the director of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University here in Australia.
Our final panelist is John L. Jackson Jr., Richard Perry University professor and Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Dean Jackson will be joining us briefly. He was at an important meeting, so he'll be signing on shortly. I want to begin with a brief note about webinar norms and the format of today. Oops, did I miss somebody?
Let's just introduce Christine Hine.
Oh, how did I miss her? I'm sorry.
Introduce you.
Hi, hello. I'm Christine Hine. I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Surrey in the UK. Hi.
My apologies for that. I was scrolling down a little too quickly. So let me begin with a brief note about webinar norms in the format of today's event. We're going to start with questions that have been pre-submitted by those of you who have viewed the recorded interviews with the panelists. And so this will take up about 50 minutes. Then at 2 p.m. California time, we're going to transition to live audience questions. So we encourage those of you attending now to submit questions via the chat option, which you can click on at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the session, our co-hosts Sharika Thiranagama and David Stanford will be monitoring the chat. So when we shift to audience questions, they will address those questions to the panelists. When you submit your questions, please indicate if you're posing a general question to all the panelists or to specific panelists. I see Dean Jackson has joined us, so I just want to welcome John L. Jackson again. And John, why don't you introduce yourself, because that way people can see you on the screen.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm late. I was trying to get off the last meeting more quickly. My name is John Jackson. I'm so happy to be in this conversation with you all today. I'm Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Is that all people have been saying?
That's it. Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm so glad we're all here now, and we can begin with the pre-submitted questions. I just want to apologize in advance if we're not able to get to all of your questions. We've tried to put together the pre-submitted questions so that we can cover as much of what you have asked. And of course, at the end, we aren't going to be able to necessarily get to all of the questions that have been submitted over chat. So we're going to begin with questions, a couple of questions that people have submitted about the pragmatics of interviewing remotely. So how have or might you negotiate remote interviews with people who don't have access to phones, laptops, reliable internet connections, or privacy due to their housing or family situation? In other words, how do we deal with digital inequality when we are trying to use remote ethnographic methods? So I'm going to just go in order alphabetical at this point, and first ask Professor Bonilla what she has to say about this.
Oh, I'm in the hot seat. We're going by last names, not first names. Then I'd have plenty of time. Well, I guess I would say, I always like to say to my students, let's not overthink this. Let's not overcomplicate this. How about you ask the folks that you're working with how they're communicating, what they're doing? I mean, because clearly, aside from talking to anthropologists, they're talking to each other, they're talking to their friends, and certainly, particularly in the moment of the pandemic, I know a lot of the students that I work with at CUNY, they're having, issues of lack of privacy, of being locked together. A lot of queer students are having a really hard time negotiating the inability to be their full selves at times with their family. But they've probably developed some strategies. And so, to also think creatively that it doesn't have to be this kind of conversation where you're intruding into someone's home, seeing their background, although if their computer has enough power, they could do a virtual one, but if it doesn't, they can't. You can also have a conversation on the phone or exchange a series of text messages or multimedia messages on WhatsApp that could include voice memos. So there might be ways in which, the conversation won't look like a traditional sit down interview with a reel to reel tape going or something. But it might be something that speaks more to the reality of conversations in our current moment. So to be open and flexible in that sense is what I would advise.
Thanks. Professor Hein?
Yeah, so completely agree with all of that, and then really would just add, I think, the point that it's always remembering that digital inequality or digital exclusion isn't an all or nothing, that digital exclusion is really multifaceted and complex, so different people comfortable with doing different things with different platforms, so we need to keep remembering always that the platform that's comfortable for us is not necessarily the platform that's comfortable for other people, and that so trying to adapt and trying to be flexible in following people's choices is a good principle here.
Dean Jackson, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's a tough one. Ultimately, I do feel like our job when we're in the field is to just think as creatively as possible about how to stay connected. And I think that's whether we're doing face-to-face or trying to deal with the distances that inequality reproduces or exacerbates. And so I think generally speaking, I often tend to be surprised at just how much access people have, even if I have to brainstorm a little bit about how to make sure they can safely deploy it or use some of my resources, repurpose my resources to give them the chance to be able to communicate both with me, but also with folks in their network if they need it, which I've done in the past, not very often, but every once in a while. So I think just trying to figure out what are all the tools at your disposal, what are the things you would never imagine you'd have to do that you might use as a bridge to help to try to find a way to cut across that divide. But I think it's a tough one. And I've been fortunate enough that most of the time, I haven't found folks who don't have access at all, but it does mean sometimes trying to figure out how to get on a time schedule that allows me to talk to them because the access isn't during the same times of the day that might be most useful or easy for me to accommodate. So I think it's just trying to be as flexible as possible and being as creative and innovative in how you think about how to redeploy the resources you might have to do that work and more, right? Some of it's about trying to figure out and I'll stop here, what it means to be an ethnographer that's also more than just creating the next great ethnographic text, but creating relationships that you sustain even after that work is done. And so some of that I think speaks to, well, what are the ways in which I can make sure if this is an issue, that the relationship, one consequence of it is that this can be addressed in ways that far outstrip the value of whatever knowledge I might produce for the academy. But it's not a great answer.
Professor Pink?
I think as an anthropologist, part of our kind of our research and our duty is to try to understand people on their own terms and how, and in this case, it would be understanding how people already communicate in their everyday lives and how we can actually, I think as been said before, enable them to connect with us in such a way that just resonates with the way that they're already communicating with others, whether or not that's digitally. So I could kind of see it as part of the basic kind of work of an anthropologist to become engaged with people in their lives in that way. Also, I also agree that most people are not totally digitally unconnected. It may be that they connect through other people. Older people, may often connect through their grandchildren or their children. There may be other ways in which to connect with such people. People don't live in isolation. So again, it depends very much on the kind of research that you're doing. If you're really trying to focus on people as individuals, without connecting through their social networks, then that's probably much more complicated, especially if you're trying to connect with them for the first time in times of crisis. But otherwise, I think that there are always ways, and it's about appreciating the ways in which people already communicate.
Is there anyone else who'd like to answer this question?
I would just add one thing. I mean, in a lot of the places that I work, I end up kind of thinking about contact in terms of synchronous and asynchronous. So things, where we're constantly in contact, sending, being in conversation, being in that more kind of interview or day-to-day kind of touch-based conversation, but also a lot of the sort of asynchronous things. So there's a lot of things that people can do without being connected and then, doing things at a certain point. So in a context like Fiji or some things where I worked recently, buying a data bundle so that they can actually, talk to me and talk to other people in their networks and kind of facilitating that connection, but having them do things like keeping diaries, taking pictures, doing other sorts of things that doesn't involve me being in constant touch with them, and then reviewing those at a point when we can be in contact is probably one of the kind of key ways that I've dealt with this in my fieldwork to date. So just leave that there.
Professor Braverman?
I guess maybe I'm a little, I don't want to put a stick in this, but just to acknowledge that there is some inequality there that maybe cannot be bridged during this time, perhaps to state that. For some communities, there cannot be trust that will be established remotely, and some do not have access. And in those instances, I believe that perhaps that kind of ethnography cannot be done remotely. So maybe just to acknowledge that point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
In the chat, someone wrote about how to interview homeless people during this time. Maybe don't interview homeless people during this time, but think about how can you write about the issues that homeless and other people and particularly vulnerable population positions are facing, and how to think. I said this in my pre-recorded video, but like, how can you not conflate anthropology and ethnography and still do anthropology even if you can't do a traditional ethnographic interview?
We have a second question that pertains to this issue of access and the pragmatics of doing interviews remotely. And that's how we approach new participants, for example, those that we've recruited through snowball sampling, and build rapport and trust with them when we're doing this only through long distance interviews. So in addition to considering the preferences of our informants, what other considerations should go into a researcher's selection of a particular medium for doing ethnography remotely. And I'm going to start on this one with Professor Horst.
So I think, again, as we were saying, meeting people where they are is a really important aspect of this. Choosing mediums that are that sort of acknowledge, where people are, but also, not using those to their kind of full capacity. So I think in the response to previous questions, people have talked about, for example, using a platform like WhatsApp that's relatively, kind of common and cost effective, but you don't have to do the interview with video and all of the other sorts of things. It's really sort of, going down to basics, keeping the audio, doing notes, that sort of thing, as you think about what you want to sort of collect. I think the other thing is, thinking about working in groups together, having people, having chats together, in households, families, depending on what you're interested in, bringing more people into the thing. I think also working, knowing when you do need to have perhaps someone there. So I often work collaboratively with people in the kind of local communities, and having them sort of be involved, when the time is right, to help kind of mediate these sort of platforms. And I think, so those are the kind of core things that I think I would start with, but I'm imagining others have things to add, so I'll turn it over.
Professor Pink?
Yeah, in terms of, how do we kind of engage with people for the first time remotely? I think that one of the things that we can do is to actually ensure that they can feel comfortable with us and to know who we are. And if we're communicating remotely, then how do we create those digital identities and identities that they can engage with remotely, so they know who we are, they know what kind of research we do. Maybe that's by creating kind of web profiles for our projects, whereby we can show the work we've done before. If, for example, in my work, I use video a lot, and when the research participants allow us to post videos of them, then when we post videos online, so people who are considering participating in our research can just have a look at the work and really understand how we kind of represent people, how we engage with people through video, and how we engage with people in field work, look at our past work, and make a really kind of informed decision about if they want to be part of a project, the kind of project that we do, and how comfortable they feel in engaging with that.
Professor Hine?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. I think there is the point where at the point where we reach out to somebody, we must expect that they will be looking to see what they can find out about us, and we need to kind of think about how to make that as good an authentic experience of us as possible right from the outset. We sometimes have challenges with that, I think, in that certainly my ethics committee would rather that when I'm having interactions with research participants, that we move that to professional spaces. So my institution ethics committee would rather I was communicating with people using my university email address and so on, and that doesn't line up very well with where I might be reaching out to people on LinkedIn or wherever. So there's an interesting kind of personal and professional kind of profiles kind of blur, and not every participant actually wants to be moved to the professional kind of email space. So that creates some interesting tensions along the way, that people don't necessarily want to do the kind of things that we think we ought to be doing in terms of keeping relationships professional. I think we're also probably going to talk about this later on as well. So I'll hand on to the next person now.
Yeah, we will continue our discussion on ethics after this. So, but does anyone else have anything they want to say about this issue of how you approach new participants and build rapport long distance? Professor Braverman?
Yeah, I guess I just would like to stress that every participant and every project is a different story, right? So some projects might not be able to move forward the way we originally planned them to move forward without being able to have that kind of physical contact and observations that we have planned. So in my own work, I'm kind of stuck because I have one chapter left for a book, and this is exactly this Bedouin community in the southern part of Israel that, yes, they do have WhatsApp and phones. In fact, they use them quite extensively, but I've not been there to establish trust and rapport. And so despite the fact that I was, that a mutual contact told them, you got to speak to this person, to this woman, they're not necessarily going to abide by that. And so I'm going to have to somehow work around this and perhaps let go of that project. On the other hand, scientists that I work with a lot, and science and conservation biologists, marine scientists, they're actually much more comfortable not spending too much time, wasting too much time in these long interviews and on-site, visits with me, kind of tailing after them. And they've been very comfortable talking on Zoom, on WhatsApp, on Skype. In fact, a lot of them, this is the way I've been communicating even before this pandemic. Sometimes that allows a kind of global reach that I'm not going to be able, or I don't want to for climate change reasons, to fly all the way, say, my work on corals, to fly all the way to remote Pacific islands. And so this is the way I've been connecting with a lot of scientists in the first place. So it really depends who we're trying to negotiate with and who we're trying to build rapport with when we're thinking about how to reach out to these people. I will say that usually I find it to be a little bit more time consuming to prepare for an interview like that, because meeting in person in a way kind of bridges a lot of sometimes gaps and things like that. Whereas if I'm going to set up an electronic meeting, then I'm going to prepare for that. I'm going to study, if it's, say, an expert, I'm going to study their work. I'm going to look into it. Maybe I'm going to even see webinars that they've done, look at their YouTube videos. So I'm going to come to the interview with kind of the respect for their time, showing respect by actually knowing what they've already said and not having them teach me everything anew. And in that sense, I'm going to also try to find these links with mutual contacts who can do the introduction for me. So I'm not reaching out of the blue to this scientist, but actually asking a colleague who already knows me and maybe trusts me from prior projects to make that kind of connection, so that there is trust that is gonna already come into play in this situation.
Dean Jackson?
I'm not sure I have a ton to add. I appreciated hearing from folks. I guess if I would maybe reiterate some of what I think I heard thematically, I would say, if there's any way to, for me, when I'm in the field, one of the things I feel often is very vulnerable, and that kind of mutual vulnerability is part of what powers, at least the version, and it's not one size fits all for ethnographers, so maybe that's not what other people feel, but for me, I know that means I'm doing something right, not doing something wrong. So trying to figure out ways to create at least some version of what feels like mutual vulnerability, mutual transparency, in ways that can allow people to think they're getting more than just some sanitized official version of the research you're coming in to study. That's not always easy to do. And sometimes maybe that's not even accurate. But I think trying to find some way to also feel like the stakes as they stand for me are also on the table can sometimes help people to feel a little bit more like this isn't just a one-way street, but this is something where it's a little more complicated for both of us. And that, I think, can maybe be valuable. But I think it's just a rephrasing of what folks said before.
Professor Bonilla, do you want to add something here?
I appreciated what John said. I guess I would just say that, building rapport is, often described as hanging out, and so there's lots of ways that you can do deep hanging out on social media. And so to not, or text messages, whatever, I think there's a way in which you can approach this as being every contact needing to be about something, to ask a question or to get, for it to be extractive, So I think to not forget that principle of just hanging out, of just chatting, of just how's your day, without every conversation having a kind of agenda and a roadmap, and feeling like, like it's a kind of spotlight. Because I think that is one of the powers, magic, tricks, secret sauce, I don't know, of anthropologists, is that sometimes people forget that we're doing research, and that's, that has pros and cons. I've had friends catch me taking notes under the table of a dinner conversation, and they're like, why, can't you just like be here, so I think, remembering that it's important to just be there sometimes, and to just chat, and for not everything to be data collecting.
Thank you all. This, I think, is a good segue into our next set of questions, which are about the ethics of field work when you're doing it remotely. We're always concerned about whether or not we are supporting the people that we are studying, whether we're respecting their concerns, and obviously, and very importantly, consent is involved in this. So one of the questions that has been raised is whether there are specific ethical issues that are raised by using remote methods when we're doing ethnography. So for example, issues around consent, privacy, confidentiality, and being confident that your interviewees are truly comfortable with their participation in the research. So how do we make sure that we are attuned to the reactions, to the level of comfort or discomfort among the people that we are interviewing, or that we are somehow, tracking through our remote methods? I think Professor Hein, you started to speak about this a bit, so perhaps we can start with you.
So the ethics issue, I think in one sense is exactly the same in all of our other domains of research and all of our other kind of research media. It is about use all of those sensitivities that you have about, is this okay, how might this feel to the other person, not just treating the the consent process as a form that is completed and then it's done. So I think in that sense the ethical issues are very much the ones that that we all know. But I think there is maybe an extra dimension here, which I think it does require of the researcher maybe sometimes a little more imagination. People think I'm slightly odd sometimes because I've had to advise a lot of people about writing their risk assessments for their ethical review. And I always say to people, I love an imaginative risk assessment. And what I mean by that is I want people to really explore what could go wrong here, how, what various things might go wrong. And I think, with the distanced research, there are things like thinking really carefully about data security, thinking about what happens if somebody misdirects this, the message that they thought they were sending to me, where we've built rapport, they're pouring their heart out, and then they misdirect that message and it goes to somebody else, or, what could go wrong? And I think that imaginative approach to ethics and to those kind of risks to well-being are really maybe even more important here than they are in other kinds of research.
Dean Jackson, do you have a comment on this?
I mean, I think probably, so the first time we started to think really carefully with our PhD students about, what difference it makes to think about ethnographic issues and ethical issues together post more traditional version of ethnography, was when we started to really do work in multimodal ethnography. So it's before COVID-19, and we were still trying to figure out what difference does it make to be using a camera, using audio equipment. Does it mean we have a different relationship to our subjects? And one of the things I think that brought home to us was that part of the point of this discussion, and this is something probably we all know, but I'll say it anyway, is that it far outstrips what we think of, say, as the IRB's mandate, right? This is about issues that you might think you have the answer to today, and that's probably what makes it so vexing. But the social context changes, the world changes, and the thing you thought was the ethically pure and upstanding thing to do now becomes exactly what you can't do. And I think that's the version of what makes this so complicated and vexing, and why it is really important to concretize this stuff and think about, well, what is happening in this moment with my interaction with these people and their investments and their political and social context that allow me to make very specific decisions that aren't simply about decisions to protect the validity of my research, but it's also decisions about making sure that I'm respecting the sanctity of who and what they are and their goals and dreams and needs. And so I think that's a kind of a way to say, for me, it's always been about recognizing that people can give you, say, consent to put their face in a video ethnography, right? They're more than willing to say, show who I am. And part of what your job is to do in a way that isn't about being condescending to them and saying you know better than they do, but saying, what is it I'm actually asking, and what are the stakes, and am I even able to comprehend all the different kinds of implications that might be right beyond the bend that I should make sure I keep front of mind as I make decisions about how to engage them ethnographically and what to use from this material. So I kind of feel like, for me, it's always about being in the moment and thinking about how to push myself on what I think I already take for granted in terms of the ethics of the work we do, and to give myself permission to say there might be more questions I need to ask in a more reflexive way about my motives, about what might be done with this material that I might not even be able to answer today, and which means I should be willing to say tomorrow, you know what, I'm going to have to go in another direction. It's not like one size fits all for all time,
Professor Pink, do you have some comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts on that, and also some reflections on projects that I'm involved in. I think one of the questions is around the intimacy of the remote encounter, just because you're not there face to face. Any kind of encounter, for example, on WhatsApp or on video or on a platform, we generate modes of intimacy when we're engaging with people, and those methods that they might already use for kind of familiar encounters. And, translating those modes of intimacy into a research context is really important for us to understand people and their lives. But it's often easy maybe to create modes of intimacy that people won't necessarily feel comfortable with making public, and they might talk about things because they feel in such a familiar situation or express them that they also wouldn't like to be made public without necessarily realizing it. So I think we need to be very aware of that. I think related to that, and this is also thinking about remote and how distant remote has to be. I mean, some projects at the moment in the COVID context, we've been considering how might we, for example, ask people to video their lives for us using GoPros and other types of technology. But we can post those technologies to them, but how do they get them back to us? Maybe they can upload video, but maybe, if we wouldn't necessarily want them to post those recordings back to us. So, think about how do we can go and collect things from people's houses, even if we don't have contact with them. They can leave them on the doorstep, or they can just hand them to us. So things like that, just being very careful about how things might go astray. I think as Christine was, saying, actually, really, in terms of how can digital things go astray if you send them to the wrong address. I mean, the same if you're posting things. And finally, I think it's just really important to check again, to ask again, because if you're not having continuous contact with somebody because it's been an encounter that was on a platform or in a particular moment, and you have a recording of them or something that they've sent you, you're not able to keep on checking in. You're not able to kind of have a chat where you ask, are you comfortable with this still, or are you not? So what we very often do, and actually in a project that I'm involved in at the moment, we're just going to send or somehow get the images that we want to present in public to the people who've already agreed that we can show their images in public, because we want to be sure, we want them to be sure, and we just like to go back to them and make sure that their really informed consent was really informed about exactly what it is we're going to do, so that they can see it in advance.
Professor Horst, did you have something to add?
Yes, I think this is probably, there's been a kind of question about the connections, the kind of visibility of connections through things like Facebook, LinkedIn, and so on, and the kind of efforts that we would go through normally to kind of protect the identity, or to think ethically about how we represent the people who participate in our studies. And we have lots of techniques for this, you know, when we do writing, but now that some of these contexts have sort of collapsed, and these mediums are really kind of part of what we do. It presents a range of new issues. I think, you know, one thing that's really important, I know a few years ago, it was really, everyone was sort of all about creating research profiles for, you know, Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram, you know, now Instagram, and using those as a kind of proxy for themselves when they're doing research. And I have generally found that that has kind of fallen by the wayside, that the people who, you know, I have worked with want my sort of real identity. They want that kind of vulnerability. They want to see who I'm friends with. They want to see, you know, pictures of my family. They want to sort of see me as a person in the way that they are making themselves sort of visible as a person. And so I have found that increasingly, we really, really do need to kind of work out, one, what we represent about ourselves in a way that's comfortable to people, but also to sort of acknowledge the connection. And people actually want that in many places. They want that kind of connection acknowledged. And you can talk to them about, you know, kind of what that means and who can see them. You can revisit it. You can do things on your own profiles, like, you know, change the kind of privacy settings. But I do find that, you know, particularly a lot of the work that I've been doing more recently in Fiji, that, you know, if I'm saying, you know, I can't friend you because my friends are there, they will not, you know, it sets up a kind of barrier in terms of our relationship. And what I found is where there are areas that are kind of conflictual, and kind of revisit the friend list and things like that, we might, you know, I might sort of message them or talk to them and say, you know, actually this is going on. Maybe we want to unfriend for now, or we want to, you know, take a break, or do things where people can't sort of see them. And certainly, you know, when you get to the end of a project, and, you know, particularly in a context like Fiji, where there might be kind of political consequences to some of the work that you're doing, you know, you need to kind of constantly revisiting that. But with that said, I think there's also really important things about acknowledging where people are. So depending on the project that you're doing, you know, so if you're studying, you know, YouTubers, or for example, that are trying to build a name and profile for themselves, even the work that I was, you know, I've done in the past with young people who are kind of writing under fan fiction names and things like that, they want the work that they're doing to be actually be publicly acknowledged. They want, you know, to say, I have participated in this research. And so you really have to acknowledge, particularly when you have people kind of building professional profiles, building a body of work, to acknowledge that in your role in sort of acknowledging them, friending them, being connected is a kind of form of legitimacy for them. And so you need to kind of understand kind of where and when you're kind of working with people. And I think the other thing is just to sort of also recognize that all of these issues around privacy, they're one, sort of mutable and changeable. So again, I found that in a context like Fiji, notions of privacy and publicness have been changing over time, even in the past sort of year. But also notions of privacy, when I do work in Australia with kind of middle class households, they have a very distinctive sense of, you know, what privacy means and what is public and private, which is often quite different from middle class families that I might be working with in context in Fiji. So really sort of acknowledging the kind of contextual, relational, and the kind of work that is that's really actually never, you know, it's never really actually done. And you need to kind of constantly be revisiting that, even when a project, a thesis finishes, and thinking about those consequences at all times.
Yes, your comments then, you know, raise this issue that I think some of our question askers have raised, which is something that I think quite a few people have been concerned with in, you know, connecting, having their informants want to connect up with their actual real social media profiles. And this raises the question of leaving a kind of trail of our research contacts in our social media, Facebook friends or LinkedIn connections. Are there others who've had to deal with this issue among our panelists and have any suggestions for how to manage these kinds of requests from our own research subjects in ways that don't either put them in a difficult situation or put other people who are, you know, connected to us in a difficult situation? Professor Hine, did you want to comment on that?
Okay, just very briefly, I think I guess the only solution I have in that sense is to talk about it with people and to talk about the why. A study I did when I recruited people via LinkedIn, because I was looking for people who had a particular kind of volunteering profile. They were spread across lots of different organizations they volunteered with, and one of the premises of the interviews was that I wasn't interviewing them in their institutional context, and that, you know, I was making a promise to them that I really wasn't going to, so anything that they said wasn't going to rebound on the organization. They weren't going to be embarrassing the organization if they were kind of critical or whatever. So that meant that we had to have a conversation about why therefore we needed to not maintain a public connection between us afterwards. And, you know, and that kind of, you know, it's part of the talking to people about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And in that particular context, you know, it was you know, perfectly understood generally that was what would happen. Other situations, I can understand that the expectations would be quite different, and the conversation might be a little bit more tricky, as the kind of situation I think that Heather was talking about possibly would be in that kind of category.
Professor Pink, would you like to comment on this?
I guess I can comment a little bit more from previous experience rather than experience specifically with social media. But, you know, in my experience, you know, sometimes you can be doing research with people who are part of an organization, and you're kind of trying to understand that organization as well as the people you're doing the research with, and they might be public figures, and they might actually wish the things that they say to you to be made public in your writing. And so that was my experience with some of the work I did with people who were involved with slow cities. And I mean, for me personally, I found it, you know, really fascinating and really rewarding to be involved with what they were doing and to make that public with them in certain ways. So I guess that it varies very much in terms of, you know, the public profiles of people you're working with and the kinds of things you wish to research with them and about them and with them as well. So very much it's about doing research with people and negotiating with them how they wish to be represented in your work. Whilst not at the same time kind of compromising your kind of independence, I guess, as an anthropologist. But we have to realize that the research we do is always kind of deeply implicated in the things that the people we're actually researching are doing, and think about how to navigate that in the most ethical and appropriate way.
Did anyone else want to comment on this?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a generational thing, but because some of my research is very politically sensitive, I've actually kept myself quite private, or tried to. I found that for my work on Palestine, Israel, for example, when I was a beginner researcher, I had a much easier time to use my Israeli Jewish privilege, and to access bureaucrats whom I wanted to interview. However, once my publication list became something that is available for people to see, I've had multiple interviews that I had already set up, been canceled without explanation with bureaucrats whom I thought were really invaluable to my work. And so I've come to be very careful about what I post publicly. If I want to, and I guess I have to be very careful here too, right? If I want to be able to continue to use my my privilege to do an insider ethnography, I feel like sometimes the social stuff and putting things publicly cannot happen for me. So I have to be even careful with what my kids, what kind of demonstrations they're at and are taking pictures of. In this world, it's very difficult to control that. And so I realize the limits of what I'm just saying, right? On the other hand, in other projects that I've had where I've been working with marine scientists for a decade and I've established a relationship and friendship and they're part of my family. And so, I mean, I guess, again, so it goes to the variability that others have spoken about already. And the fact that I'm not on Facebook, I've actually pulled myself out of it, and not on Twitter, and very limited amount of that kind of social media in order to protect that kind of ability to do the research that I'd like to still do politically.
Thanks very much. I'm going to shift to the next question because I know we have a lot of questions coming in the chat. So I want to be able to turn over to the live questions before long. But I do want to ask specifically about some forms of evidence that have come up in the recorded interviews. So Professors Bonilla and Jackson discussed engaging with forms of what Professor Bonilla called found evidence. So media products that are already available online. And several people have asked questions about recommendations that you might have for strategies of analyzing this found evidence that might be different from the way we analyze data that we elicit ourselves. So Professor Bonilla, would you be able to respond to this?
Sure. I don't know if it's about strategies that are different from the ones we use with our own interviews, but just thinking and reconnecting. I notice on the chat people are also asking to say more about the relationship between ethnography and anthropology. And, you know, for me, anthropology is about asserting the fact that there are different ways of living in the world. And so, you know, any kind of cultural text, it could be something that I elicited in an interview, or it could be a meme, or it could be a song. You know, showing how that makes sense in a particular context, given the particularity of what it means to live in that world, in that digital world, mediated world, cultural world, or, you know, political, social world. And so in my first book, you know, and I wanted to say, you know, we shouldn't exoticize remote research so much, because I feel like, you know, the idea that there is, you know, unmarked research means that there's also unmarked anthropologists who are able-bodied, who have childcare, who have research funds, can travel, all these things. And you know, for a long time, anthropologists have not fallen into those categories and have been creative in their methods. So just as a way of reassuring students that they don't have to completely invent the wheel right now, and that they should be looking at books, especially second books from anthropologists, to look at how people have been doing remote research for a long time, even before it was a thing, you know? And so in my first book, you know, I had the time that I spent in the field when I was a graduate student, but then once I became a faculty member, I was not able to be in the field as much, but I still kept up with my informants. And so I analyzed radio shows. I analyzed live streams. I analyzed memes. I love memes. And I also analyzed song lyrics. All of these things speak to a cultural world, you know, unpacking why a particular phrase makes sense, why a particular, you know, reference or metaphor is powerful in a place. You know, that's something that it requires knowledge of the place, but it doesn't necessarily require a face-to-face interview. So to me, you know, those are some of those, you know, kind of putting what are these things saying, and also, you know, even when I can do a face-to-face interview or phone interview, there are reasons why I already turn to memes and music and stuff, because I feel like they get to something that we're not always able to articulate in words. Specifically, in my context of social movements, I think that there's something what some might call structures of feeling, or, you know, things that are in a kind of register that hasn't taken full discursive form. So to me, the protests that I studied in Guadeloupe, there were things that you could only understand through the artistic representations, through the songs, through the music that emerged during that period, that hinted at something that wasn't in the manifestos, and that the participants in the movement, they couldn't, we can't treat, again, like, to not be extractive, like, human beings aren't like taking a soil sample. Like, you can't just like extract from them what this means. They don't necessarily know, and so we have to kind of read between the lines, even in what they say. And so I think that there, just like there's a lot in depth in ethnographic interview, there's also a lot that one can mine in the cultural products that are produced by the folks that we're interested in, not to mention the kind of media projects that exist in their world and that make sense to them, but that might not make sense to others.
Dean Jackson, you also discussed in your interview a range of media products that you had been able to use. And so perhaps you could comment on this question about strategies for dealing with that kind of found evidence.
So first of all, I just want to second what Jarima said. I really don't have much to add to that. Ultimately, one of the things I try, this is a little bit of an overstatement, but I think it sometimes works rhetorically. So I try to tell students that there's a version of what you get with this found material, the stuff that I see produced by Hebrew Israelites that you find online on YouTube or someplace else, that is almost the quintessential example of what the Holy Grail is in ethnographic terms, right? Because part of what you get there is stuff that you had no role in helping to produce or co-produce in any way, you think, right? And so you can take this thing up and imagine it would have existed, it would have happened, it would have been produced regardless of your engagement with the community. And so I kind of feel like part of what I always want to focus on when students at Penn are thinking about their own ethnographic projects is that for us, the distinction we want to think we make between remote and in person is a little bit of a mirage, because part of what you're always doing is you're always dealing with a field site that far outstrips its geographical locatedness, right? Which is a point that is really about saying, not like how do we simulate doing ethnographic or anthropological strategies on these other texts, but really about saying, what does it mean to look, to see, to hear, to smell, to feel anthropologically? And I think you can do that even if what you produce as a function of that isn't a traditionally rendered ethnographic monograph, because there's, I think, a certain kind of sensibility, an approach to one's relationship with other people, to questions that are existential, as well as cultural and political, that have to be about sort of leveling the distance we think we need between what happens face to face and what we're able to see over someone's virtual shoulder online or anywhere else. And so I think trying to be good about, as Jarima said earlier, not fetishizing that distinction is I think key. And then I think it gets you to a place where you're not making decisions about remote research that are predicated on this reification of what that difference is, as though we weren't always already doing experience near and experience far ethnographic work all the time, which we weren't.
I think this is leads very well into a discussion I wish we had more time for about this whole question of, co-production, how that relates to our in-person ethnographic research versus our, remote ethnographic research. Perhaps we can think of it as a certain kind of amalgam or a continuum of the ways in which we're involved in that co-production. One question I had, however, is most likely at the end of that, or one of that continuum, are the kinds of requests that we might make of our informants, our interlocutors, that they actually engage in some form of cultural production. So, for example, I know Professor Hein mentioned sometimes asking people to keep diaries, and that to me what sounded like a very intriguing method. So perhaps Professor Hein, you could comment on this and how you think this fits into this sort of assemblage of methods that we use to co-produce with our informants.
Yeah, sure. And I should say here, you know, I'm largely building on actually things I've learned from some of our fabulous graduate students at Surrey here using this kind of approach. So yeah, largely here, this is not things that I've done myself, but things I've learned from other studies that have been going on at Surrey. And here I think, well. The interview has this thing that it is very much this kind of rather, whatever we do about building rapport, it is quite a cleaned up, retrospective, relatively coherent narrative about life. And things like diary methods can be great for just giving us those little insights into a slightly different perspective on life, you know, a bit more moment by moment, a bit less kind of pre-digested for us and narrated for us. So we often use diary methods, you know, maybe it's a specific kind of activity that we're interested in. So Joe Hope did research at Surrey looking at how people who were parenting a child with multiple and profound disabilities, how those people drew on various kinds of support, including internet support. And she worked on designing diary methods that would allow those parents to capture a moment of advice seeking and just capture something about what they were looking for, what they found, and whether it helped. And so that kind of method is not generating this kind of transparent representation. This is what the people do, and I can therefore see from this diary that people use this kind of advice 6 times and this kind 4 times. It's kind of not about that, but it's about just capturing moments which often then we will go back and talk to people in interviews and explore with them and reflect back on them. So it just becomes, it's another device towards a conversation rather than, you know, kind of perfect data capture. But if you're designing a diary, you have got to think about, what am I going to prompt people to capture? How am I going to prompt people to kind of reflect on things? So we are structuring it just as we would be if it were a semi-structured interview. You know, we still are usually diary methods, people structure them. So we got to think about, what's the kind of temporality that I want to build into this? Am I asking people to reflect at the end of a day, or is it like Joe Hope's trying to get people to catch a moment? So thinking about the temporality of the actions that we're interested in, thinking about how we're going to structure that, thinking about the right medium for the people that we are engaging with. And that's often about providing a choice of media, because the whole thing about these diary methods is that they are ready to hand. So that might be anything from a piece of paper that people can actually scribble on that's with them, to an app. I know people have had great success with repurposing the online survey platforms as kind of online diary platforms, thinking about, you know, prompts by text message or whatever, just to remind people, or to say, oh yeah, could you take a picture of what you're doing at the moment, or could you just write a sentence about something that's just happened, you know. So lots of different ways of structuring them, lots of different media, lots of different kind of ways of thinking about the temporality, but just as a different kind of way of reaching out into somebody's kind of everyday lived experience that adds to the interviews.
Wonderful. That's very useful. I wish we could go on talking about this particular subject. I think it's really productive. But I'm going to have to hand over now to the session to Sharika Thiranagama and Dave Stanford, who've been madly organizing the live questions as we've been having this conversation. So I'm going to hand over now to Sharika.
Hi, I mean, it's a pleasure to moderate this, because you guys are making my job redundant as I go along. You're answering all these questions that come up. But Dave and I have been trying to sort into 2 different rounds. So let me just start off with, I see a fair amount of questions. Professor Maria, you started answering them around the relationship between anthropology and ethnography. And I want to just ask two questions in relation to that. First of all, I think for a lot of students, they're very concerned about how do you appear within a discipline while doing these kind of methods. I mean, I think when you advance in your career, you can say, I'm going to do research whichever way I want to, but how in this moment do you also appear as if you're doing anthropology or sociology or so on in these methods, and how might we, and I'm asking that from a student perspective, perhaps. And the second question I also see coming up is, how do we make dense research, or how do we attend to questions of density? So if it's not only interviews, but other methods, what are the ways in which to deal with making research dense? And the other question is, we always think about questions of representation. So if there are communities, for example, who are, because of digital inequality, or individuals cannot be represented, how do we think about representation? And how do we think about digital methods that are not about the internet per se? If the internet is not, access to the internet is not the only way of doing digital research. So I know those are very broad questions, but I think we can maybe ask most of the panel to whichever of those they want to answer, and then I'll hand over to Dave to ask another set of questions.
I want to offer an irreverent answer, but I would love to hear from Dean Jackson, from his dean position, what he thinks. But this question of how to perform that you're doing anthropology, I think that maybe that you're doing that mostly for your committee members. So maybe check in with them. They're the ones that are, I always say that your dissertation is like a driver's license that then allows you to drive down any road you want. So, I think that is something that you have to negotiate with them, and that maybe in this moment they will be more flexible about what that looks like. And the reason I say that, and then that it's a little bit irreverent, is that, I've talked with colleagues who say, we train students to be so traditional and so narrowly anthropological. And then when we are on a search committee, we're looking for creativity and innovation, not for traditional research. So I think, and this is why I said I want to hear from a dean perspective what that looks like in terms of hiring. But I know that on many search committees that I've been, we want people doing innovation. We want people doing new things. And also being innovative allows you to apply to different kinds of jobs. Not just an anthropological job, but a job in an ethnic studies program, or in a media studies program, or a history program. So I think, and I always tell students also to not peg yourself on like what's either traditional or trendy, but on what you actually want to do, what interests you, because that's the best project that you're going to do. The one that's going to be interesting and that people are going to want to read is the one that would have only occurred to you. And so everyone will, oh, well, who would have thought of that? And that's going to be very, very interesting and attractive on the job market. Although I would really stress to not worry so much about being trained in a traditional way as much as to be trained in an innovative way that can also help you maybe even think beyond the ivory tower.
And since you mentioned me, I'll just jump in and say, I think, and this might be encouraging for students, I'm not sure. I think for the most part, deans and provosts would defer to departments on what, say, an anthropologist looks like, right? I mean, those are the experts. And so if the department says this is where anthropology is going, or this is what it looks like, or this is what it should look like, I think most deans, most provosts would defer to that and try to champion what they need, because they know these are the people who are telling them where the institution should be headed. And I think again, it's going to sound maybe a little Pollyanna-ish, but for me, if you are committed to anthropology and you imagine you're in conversation with anthropologists, then anthropology is what you do, period, right? And I think often some of the concern, especially in a multi or interdisciplinary universe, is when other anthropologists think that you're not trying to talk to them, and maybe you're not, but I think you have to answer questions about who your audience is, about what the engine, the methodological and epistemological engine is that drives your question asking and answering. And if anthropology is central or constitutive of that stuff, then I think you claim it. You say, I am anthropology, and it's what I do. And you try to make that case as convincingly, as confidently as you can. And I think to be able to do it compellingly means people, even if they'll never do the version of anthropology you do, will have to respect that that's a version that needs to have space to grow, to develop, and to find its audience and community.
And can I throw it open to the rest of the panel too? Because some of you are also anthropologists, but some of you are sociologists or, science, work on STS. So.
Yeah, could I say something about, for me, the dialogue between anthropological theory and ethnographic practice is really at the core of a lot of the work I do. And I think that's kind of fundamental in an anthropology PhD, and actually trying to kind of think about that relationship between your theoretical commitments and the ethnographic work that you do. But I suppose I'm also really an advocate for kind of much more impure anthropology. So I think it's really important to think about how our anthropology can become disrupted by our contact with other academic disciplines, to think about how we might advance anthropology by thinking theoretically in new ways, and to not be afraid of contaminating the idea that anthropology isn't pure and can be contaminated by contact with other disciplines, but to really think about how we might move on in different ways whilst being aware of the kind of the anthropological commitments that we make at the same time. So I suppose I would kind of say that think about what can an interdisciplinary anthropology look like? How can our contact with other disciplines really, really benefit us? And to not to be, I suppose, scared of moving out of that space or enabling kind of PhD anthropology to kind of advance and move on in that way, because the PhD space is also a really important space to kind of drive innovation within scholarship, and to not to have to always adhere to the kind of the parts of the discipline, I think, that hold it back.
Can I just add in, kind of following from Sarah? I think, one, just an acknowledgement that there are many different kinds of anthropology. I mean, I'm someone who did my undergraduate in the US, did my PhD in the UK, went back to the US, have moved to Australia. I'm in a very kind of interdisciplinary space. And in each of those things, there's national traditions. There are things about doing my PhD that made me not fit necessarily in US context, and some of the debates that were happening there, that there have been other sorts of things. I mean, Sarah and I have been involved at the same institution that was, involved in this thing called the Digital Ethnography Research Center initially. And it was a very interdisciplinary space with, anthropologists, sociologists, cultural studies, media studies, et cetera. And those have been really quite productive space. And I've actually felt that I probably had more kind of impact in terms of the way of thinking, as an anthropologist, the way that I was sort of trained in those interdisciplinary conversations than perhaps even in the kind of discipline of anthropology. And that's meant that we've had a much farther sort of reach. We've started to, I am doing a project at the moment that is very, kind of more traditional anthropology. And I love kind of coming back to that. But I've also been able to kind of engage with designers, with education scholars, with a whole range of different disciplines that really have made my work richer, and the kind of anthropology that I've been engaged with, perhaps more distinctive than, trying to adhere to, because I was in a kind of department where, it was do the area studies thing, don't, there do seem to be kind of rules about what you're supposed to do at a particular time. But if you don't love what you're doing, you're stuck with a project that someone else has designed. And that's just different. I mean, I think everyone in this kind of COVID moment will have to kind of change the way that they approach it. It will always look different, but it was always going to, no matter what, COVID or not. What you plan to do is always going to look different when you come out the other side. And that's the great thing about doing that work. So I would just sort of add the kind of appreciation of the many kinds of anthropology that, that we actually are able to do. And it's one of the disciplines that you are not, in a way, kind of curtailed by method, curtailed by, you know, having to do, you know, worry about statistics. You know, I mean, you really are, you know, you're supposed to adapt methods and adapt ways of finding, of knowing and understanding that is particular to the kind of questions you do. And not all disciplines have that kind of feature. So I'll stop.
And Professor Braverman?
Yeah, I guess I don't know. Maybe I'm the only non-formal anthropologist here in the panel. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. There's, but I guess I don't have enough fingers to say how many times I've been told that what I'm doing is not an ethnography. And actually, I'm just reviewing a piece now that now the reviewers, the anonymous reviewers, have just told me that this is not a legal ethnography, right? So I'm in a law school, I'm in a geography department, and I see myself as doing ethnography, but in fact, I don't want to struggle over how to call this. One of the chat questions was like, did you have any issues with doing remote ethnography with any, I guess it was with the press or something like that. And I remember, not with the press didn't seem to care less, but I remember being a fellow at the Rachel Carson Center. And I remember the whole group of anthropologists in the room basically telling me that my work with marine scientists is not an ethnography on coral science. It's the fact that I did Skype interviews is not immersive enough to be rendered ethnography. And so I pulled the word ethnography from this. And it's very interesting because actually I was approached by David here to speak about this exactly because of that piece of Coral Whispers, which was then covered by the Royal Institute of Anthropology, et cetera, as an ethnographic piece, as a cutting edge approach, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe this does go to prove, I guess, Heather's point, and that you kind of follow your heart, and then whatever it's called is going to find its way out. But there is a sort of policing that every discipline does. And I'm in the law school, and I know how many times have I heard, like, is this really a legal piece? Like, where's the law here? And I hear from sociologists, so what is your methodology? Do you really even have one? So when you do this kind of interdisciplinary work, I mean, in a way, this is an indication that you're doing it, that there's going to be work of translation, right? That people are going to ask you, this is not what we're familiar with. Can you please show us that you're part of us, or else maybe we won't, publish you or whatnot. So when you're a little bit more established, then you've got the privilege of, okay, you don't want this, I'll go somewhere else. But I do think that it is a question that maybe more junior faculty and students might need to contend with. In that sense, yes, you do need to work with people, with your committee, to get that kind of support for your work.
And I wondered, because I'm going to hand over to Dave very soon, I wondered, Christine, whether you wanted to answer that too, and maybe just also address some of the density questions that about how to, in practical terms, also how to think about making research that is dense.
Yeah, okay, yeah, maybe I can kind of connect the two things together. I have to say, Dean Jackson, as you were talking, I was scribbling down that, I think I got it, the epistemological and methodological engine that drives what you do. I just love that. That's just such an elegant way to capture it, I think. Yeah, I'm a sociologist and was kind of brought up as a sociologist amongst an atmosphere of the sociology of scientific knowledge. And that field has this deep interest in how do we make our knowledge claims convincing to one another, and insists on kind of directing that back reflexively on itself, as as much as anybody else's knowledge claims that we might be looking at. So I think that kind of gives some fuel here for thinking about, is what we're doing, is what you're doing, with whatever remote or conventional methods or whatever, is this something that we can build some convincing knowledge claims with, that will convince people? Because in the end, what's good enough is what we can use to make an intervention with, to make somebody think differently, to engage with a theoretical construct and show something about how it works here or how it works differently. So, you know, whether I'm doing that as a sociologist or you're doing that as an anthropologist, there is a lot to be said about it. It's as good as what we do with it. And, you know, if it feels real to you, if you're there and you feel that you are, you know, you're engaging, you're capturing stuff, if it feels real, it's real, and you can do powerful things with it, and you can make powerful claims with it. So I think, you know, trust that will happen, I think. And that's probably the most optimistic thing that anybody has ever said using sociology of scientific knowledge. So yeah, treasure that moment as well. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand over to Dave now, who has our next cluster of questions. So thank you.
Okay, everyone, I'll go one at a time. The first question is to the whole panel. It's a familiar question for ethnographers. It's about extraction from communities and reciprocity. So, and I'm wondering if you can put this specifically to the topic of digital and remote methods. I'll read this here. In what ways do you think about giving back to your research participants? How do you make relationships and outcomes more reciprocal? And especially if your interlocutors may never read your work. This is a question that, remote or not, is always applicable. How do you specifically think about giving back remotely or digitally? And that's posed to the whole panel.
I can say a little bit. One thing, the last research project that I was doing after Hurricane Maria, we were recruiting people for focus groups, and I felt, you know, it just felt very strange in the middle of everything that people were going through to ask them to take time to do, you know, to participate in this project without giving anything back. But at the same time, given the culture in Puerto Rico, it felt very weird to give them money. So what we did was that we bought gift cards for we bought gift cards to give out, and we, you know, got that approved through the IRB. But then we wanted to give it to a store that everyone in different parts of the island had access to. And so that actually ended up being Walmart. I'm embarrassed to say, but Walmart also has it's partnered with local supermarkets in Puerto Rico. So it was a gift card to the supermarket, and it was small. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a big windfall, because we also didn't want it to be the determining factor in them choosing to do the focus group. But I know that it was appreciated, and so that was, you know, a kind of very mundane way of at least compensating for people's time in that moment. The other thing that I do to give back in a sense, more in a more intellectual way, is I have a monthly column in the Puerto Rican newspaper, and so I try to write about, you know, the things that I think I can maybe shed some light on. And you know, anthropologists don't often have newspaper columns, and I'm one of the few women with a regular column in that particular newspaper. It's mostly former politicians, economists, etc. And so I know that a lot of people really appreciate a different take that I have on things, and it's hard. It's a tax every month. It really stresses me out before I've submitted it. But I think it's also a way, again, of introducing myself, and having a little bit more of that kind of transparency and accountability, and you know, kind of the things that John was saying too, of, you know, where do I sit in things, you know, like I ask people a million questions, so how about I tell them what I think about a few things as well. So I've done that, and I also published a book that was a collection of essays with artists, journalists, scholars, in which I just have an introduction, and, you know, used my contacts to get it published with a trade press, Haymarket Books in the U.S. And so made sure that voices that are usually not published in English, usually not accessible broadly, are in a trade press book that has sold really well. And then I invested my own personal research funds in getting that translated into Spanish so that it's also available to the local public.
I think to add to that, I think that that the giving of gift cards to research participants. I mean, some people frown on that, but we do that in many of our projects, and it's not about paying people to participate in research. And we should always kind of push that idea away. It's actually about giving somebody a gift to say thank you for participating in work and giving some of their time. And people are very often, I've found, and I know there's a common experience of it, they're surprised and pleased because often they didn't expect it, or they'd forgotten that it was part of participation. So I think that's a really important thing for us to acknowledge, that can be a really positive part of anthropology. There are a couple of other things that I wanted to mention, because we shouldn't assume that anthropologists are always doing our work as lone researchers, just being the only ones who are having contact with the people who participate in the research. A lot of anthropology can be done in teams and interdisciplinary teams. So, for example, one project I'm involved in involves people actually being involved in technology trials or testing technologies or using technologies in various ways. And in that sense, one of the other things that they're actually getting out of the project is the opportunity to engage with new technologies that they would never have encountered before, which can be a super interesting process for people. But I think there are other ways that we can also kind of engage and give back to the people we've worked with. When I mentioned the research I did with the Slow City movement in the past, and that also led to me giving talks about the movement, but also sometimes for them, from my perspective as an anthropologist, but also as part of the engagement with them, which was helpful and useful for them once I gave a talk for the British part of the movement, because they were busy with a general meeting and they couldn't attend an event themselves, so they had an anthropologist represent them. And the other thing is making films with and about research participants as well, because the film is something that you can share with them as well as with a wider community, and the consultation with them about how they're represented in the film is obviously also very important. So our work shouldn't just necessarily be about writing articles and writing books that are inaccessible to our participants, but like the example of the newspaper column or a film or video clips, there are other ways that we can kind of engage our participants in dissemination that are interesting for them too.
Dean Jackson, may I ask you to follow up on that? In your interview, you discussed composing videos for your participants for their, just to mark celebrations and personal events. I wonder if you could touch on that as a filmmaker.
So I will say, I think Sarah did a nice job of framing that. I guess the only thing I would emphasize in what she already laid out was that often there was no publicly facing ethnographic film ever in mind. Right? This is about saying that if there's a gift to give, and it was even, for the work I did as a graduate student back in the 90s, when everything hadn't gone completely digital and portable. We'd started, but it wasn't like the camera was on every phone at that point. It really meant something that you could come in with a pretty high quality camera and record someone's birthday party, or record graduation and give them a nicely edited, 5, 10, 30-minute version of that event. Again, on VHS tape that they could have. And I think I continue to find ways of using filmmaking as a way to maybe do that version of what people call building rapport, and also giving back or trying to feel like I'm creating a dynamic that is a little more dialogical. So the Hebrew Israelites, who are incredibly gifted media makers and do their own, I could never even imagine, as I've said before, making a film about this community, because they make so many powerful films about themselves from different angles, different perspectives. But I've collaborated with them on their projects, and I've allowed my skills as a film producer and director to help them think about the work they want to produce. And that's a version, I think, of that same dynamic that says, for me, it isn't going to end in an ethnographic film at all, but I'm hopeful that some of those skills will translate into being able to give them things that will be useful for their film projects, for the stuff they want to produce and send out into the world.
Thank you for those answers. We have about 4 minutes, and I'd like to pose potentially the last question to the panel. Maybe Professors Horst, Hein, and Braverman could pick this up. We had a question in the chat about IRB. Did your university's IRBs panels have particular concerns at all about, have you noticed particular concerns about remote research methods? And also, I'm wondering if you could help us, give us, set the scene. What does a day in the life of a remote or digital ethnographer look like or feel like? So IRB, and what does it feel like to do this work day in and day out?
Okay, so yeah, so I have the interesting kind of position of yes, so I have to apply for so for us it's an ethics committee, not IRB, but the same thing. But I've previously been the chair of my university's ethics committee for a few years, so I've been as they say, poacher and gamekeeper in this one. I've been both sides of the table, and so I think as committee reviewers, our concerns are very much captured in that kind of thing I was trying to talk about earlier on, that kind of imaginative assessments of any risks to well-being and participant dignity and well-being and rights and so on. But the other thing I have to say, though, about all of that is increasingly, I think our ethics committees and other countries have this, are also kind of defenders of the institution as much as they are defenders of ethics. And in the UK, in Europe, the new General Data Protection Regulation has created a kind of a new raft of issues. The Cambridge Analytica scandal, some of the responses from the platforms in terms of locking down APIs. It's become I think rightly an area where people are more cautious about just scraping loads of data. I think that's absolutely right. I think it's possibly slightly unfortunate that that has caught in its net a lot of very small scale, careful, ethical, non-challenging, non-frightening studies that have to go through the same machinery of review, but can often make their case. And so, okay, so I'm coming out on a positive note again. I'm trying to come out on a positive note. I think researchers in this area are having to educate their ethics committees and their IRBs. They always have had to, and I think they continue to need to. And I think we need in all of our applications to show what thoughtful, caring, well-informed researchers we are. We need to do our homework, and then we can, so yes, you'll get problems getting it through review. Yes, you probably will, but, kind of expect to make the case, and we can do it generally. Heather, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to point out how variable ethics committees, having worked at a number of institutions, one institution is completely concerned about, their kind of legal responsibilities. Another one is completely concerned with the kind of subjects, but to the point of, also jeopardizing the kind of rapport and relationships. So they're really quite variable. You end up having to negotiate these at every single institution. It's because it's people, who have greater or lesser understanding. We've had a thing where we had someone who was a kind of juvenile justice criminologist on the kind of panel, and had a kind of psychiatric nursing thing, and they completely didn't let us do stuff on like fan fiction, on texts that were already out there, because that was the sort of frame. So they're so negotiated and complex in that sort of way. And I think also are not accounting for, the kind of complexities of doing things. I mean, I'm doing at the moment a lot of work, just something has emerged in the research I've been doing in Fiji. We've got a kind of messenger WhatsApp group of, people, in Fiji, in, 4 different institutions sitting on this thing, kind of analyzing it together and pulling things down and doing that. And, we're going, okay, whose ethics is going to be the right ethics for this sort of thing? Australia always would see theirs as, superior to what might happen in the Pacific, but actually the Pacific might be, more. So there's a lot of those sort of things that I think are really, again, as complicated and convoluted as the kind of questions we're looking at it, actually doing the work. So these are things that there's not really a one answer. Sometimes we've used examples from other institutions to make a case for that. There's always a kind of presence, but a lot of it is talk to your fellow researchers, talk to them to kind of work out what you sort of do, and do take a really honest, hard look at what you're proposing and the kind of, threats around data and privacy and those sort of things that are there. I will stop because I think we have one other panelist. So.
Yeah, I really don't want to comment too much about the IRB because again, I'm not in an anthropology department. And so actually for many years, my work fell in between and I was not even required to go through IRB. Because in law schools, interestingly, when you do work with experts and with bureaucrats, doesn't fall necessarily into the scope of ethnography. And only in recent, decade, I've actually initiated, I want to experience this. Everybody's telling me these horror stories and I kind of want to go through it. At a certain point, I even wanted to do an ethnography of the IRB with relationship to bioart and stuff that I was working on. But I've not had any issues with the IRB, so I don't, and also with the remote interviews that I've done, I don't, as long as, you get the consent, as long as you're clear, as long as you tell people that you're recording, ask, perhaps just to say that when you're not in the same room, in some instances, it might be less obvious that you're recording, so you want to make that obvious. Maybe this is obvious, so I just want to state that. I did want to, though, relate to the gifting question, because actually it's interesting what it kind of caused for me, because it just kind of, I was thinking about my work with settlers and with people, with bureaucrats whom I don't have an affinity with, and in fact don't politically necessarily, my views don't correspond with theirs. And I'm just thinking about this idea of gifting, and it's harder for me to think about that in that context of even wondering whether I should give these people a voice and whether that voice is in fact reinforcing sometimes their problematic or racist comments. So I do want to say that there's a variability on what you want to give back also to your informants / interviewees, interlocutors. On the other hand, when I was working with climate change scientists, I felt much more affinity, as a diver myself. And I've taken on, I didn't want to disappoint them because I was going to give them a voice, and that voice needed to be strong enough so that they didn't waste their time with me and the book is going to just come out some sort of book that nobody reads. And so I don't know, I was really nervous about that. I really changed the essence of the book from being an academic book to being a book that would be that would be relevant to a wider audience, because I felt like that was my gift back. And I know that might sound egotistical because I'm writing and also promoting myself, but in a way it was outside of my regular way of writing, and I pushed myself to write differently because I felt like this was I was giving back to the people who trusted me with their stories of grief and in the face of the death of the animals they've been working with for so many years.
Thanks for that, everyone. We've run a little long on time, so I'm going to pass it over to Sylvia now.
Yes, I'm so sorry that we've run out of time and won't be able to answer any remaining questions. I just think that this has been a wonderful discussion, and it's made it clear that this moment has made it possible and even necessary to open up a conversation about more than just methods of data collection, but obviously about knowledge production more broadly in ethnography and its relation to anthropology and sociology and other allied disciplines. So I want to thank the participants for generously contributing their time, the panelists for all the time and effort that they put into making the video recordings, and in this live question and answer session, making it so informative and lively. And thanks to you and the audience who've been participating and for submitting thoughtful and important questions. In closing, let me just remind you that the video recordings of all of the interviews with the panelists will continue to be available online at the website iriss.stanford.edu/doing ethnography remotely. So we thank you all for contributing and hope you have a good day or evening wherever you are. Thank you and goodbye.